Okay. Hello. Welcome to the first episode of the Civil Conversation series. The topic today is implicit racial bias. Just to introduce the topic, I'm going to define bias and implicit bias. So, bias is defined as a prejudice in favor of or against a group or group of people. Implicit biases are subconscious and ones that can contradict our conscious beliefs. They are associations made in our communities, media, and personal experiences that reinforce our bias in favor of or against a group. For this conversation, we will be talking about implicit biases in the context of race. The goal of this conversation is to talk through our own implicit biases and practical ways to address and combat them. So to begin, let's start with introductions. So if you can say your name, age, and the community you were raised in, we can get a better idea of who's in this conversation. So I'll start. My name is Uha. I'm 23 years old, and I'm a first generation Indian American raised in a suburban middle class family in Georgia. And then Arthi, if you can go.
Hi, my name is Arthi Nithi. I am also 23 years old. I was born and raised in North Jersey, and I came to Atlanta for undergrad and have been living there ever since.
Cool. My name's Chris Turner. I'm also 23 years old. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, but I have moved to 6 different states. Obviously, I'm of African American descent, and progressively through all of our moves to those 6 different states, we kind of went up in terms of our financial income. So I've seen a bunch of different types of communities and people, and had exposure to different types of people living in different regions.
Cool. My name's Ethan Webster. I was born in Tacoma, Washington. I'm 29 years old, so a little bit older than everybody else here. But I was born and raised in a middle class, suburban home. My whole family, they're all little people. So I think that added a lot to how I was raised. And I was also born and raised as a member of the Church Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A lot of people know them as the Mormons, but in that community, I was born and raised in that community. That's taught me a lot as well.
Cool. So thank you for kicking this series off. I really appreciate you guys. So I'm just going to jump into the questions. So I have a couple questions that I wrote out to guide this conversation, and we'll just see where it takes us. So the first question is, what are racial implicit biases or associations you have seen or experienced that were made against you?
Yeah, I think I could start this one off. I think, there have definitely been multiple situations in which I've run into this. I think some of the most notable have been interactions with the police. I don't have any records or anything of that nature, but I definitely have seen such scenarios in which I've been singled out explicitly. There was one alleged traffic violation, which was really DWB, so it was just me driving while black. So that one kind of got thrown out when I ended up going to court because the dash cam recording kind of showed I wasn't doing anything wrong. And then there was another scenario that happened in Athens where I was basically just kind of singled out from a crowd and given a citation for nothing. So I've seen those kind of biases. I've definitely experienced them, but I don't think that they are as commonplace or as violent as they tend to be portrayed nowadays. So
When you say singled out, were you in a group of people who were not Black?
yeah, I was the only one who was black. The one with me in the car, obviously, was the only person in the car. But yeah, being in Athens, being in a group of people that was racially diverse, but again, I was the only one who was black, and I think for that reason, that was why I was kind of singled out in that scenario. So
Yeah, I haven't had any problems with law enforcement. I actually think that the associations or implicit bias help me in those situations. I feel like generally for the Indian American community, we're seen as like model immigrants. And that has helped us in those situations and then hurt us in situations where we might not necessarily, I guess, meet people's criteria. So I know for me, I went to Georgia Tech and people already assumed that I would be a certain level of intelligence. And I would be in conversations with any community and they're automatically like, oh, you're probably way smarter than us. And you're like really good at math. You're really good at XYZ. You're probably going to be a doctor. Those assumptions were made. And I feel like a lot of people see those as positive assumptions. But I felt like an undue amount of pressure. And in conversations, if I didn't meet those expectations, then people would be like, oh, you're kind of dumber than we thought you would be. So that was an assumption that would be made against me, even though inherently it seems like a really positive assumption.
Yeah.
If you don't meet that expectation, then that can be uncomfortable in situations.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, that was one of the things that I thought of. I think the Asian community in general, there's a lot of this implicit bias on how we are academically. And I think nowadays a lot more people are more vocal, but that adds on to a lot of like microaggressions, just defining how we need to be in our life, like professionally. That's definitely something I think I've experienced. I was gonna say, like, I don't think I've experienced any one-on-one encounters, or I should take that back. I meant with law enforcement specifically. I do think I have a little bit of fear just with what I see on media, or yeah, I haven't had any personal, but for my skin color, just because it's darker, I do have that fear.
Right.
But yeah, going back to the Indian community, I know socioeconomically, like the Indian community definitely is viewed as higher up. So when it comes to that, I think we are definitely put on a pedestal at times. But on the flip side, I think media kind of makes a mockery of us, when it comes to like food or accents. Those are just like a couple things, like, like in The Simpsons, like Apu had the accent. I think growing up, like everyone thought Indians were like that. And there's many times like people assume like Indians smell bad, things like that. So those are a few. And I just going on to just being darker skinned, there's a ton of implicit things that come along with colorism, which is a form of racism in itself. So when it comes to that, I wouldn't say it's more. I don't think I've experienced anything outright, but it's sometimes the subtle things that are the most dangerous. Like knowing you won't be viewed a certain way or have as many opportunities. So those are definitely some struggles I've had growing up.
I agree with those. And also because we are expected to have certain professions, when we don't have those professions, they're seen as lesser than, or assumed to be like we went awry or something went wrong. So that is, those are definitely associations that I think can be hurtful, even if you think they're inherently positive associations.
I'll speak up. One thing that I guess it's not a racial bias, but a bias that I experienced secondhand was with my parents and my sister being little people. They're obviously automatically seen as handicapped and disabled, and so whenever we went to the store or whenever we went anywhere, everybody was always staring. And on top of that, my sister recently, not recently, but when I was older and able to kind of see more clearly about these things, my sister was going through certification to be a sign language interpreter, and she kind of told me her story about how everywhere she went, every job opportunity that she applied for, every job that she actually went to, everybody before she started even signing and before they could even see her skill set automatically put a bias on her that she wouldn't be able to do the job because she was a little person. And that goes for my father as well. He was just a high school graduate. He didn't get any formal education, and so anywhere that he went, it was automatically, okay, what can or can't he do because he's little. It was never a question of, oh, what does he bring to the table? What skills does he have? It was always a matter of what can't he do, or how is he going to hinder our company or our experience because he's a little person. And so growing up, I think that was the biggest bias that I was able to experience. And I guess recently, with how political everything has gotten and how politics is such a big thing in the media, I think that I'm I'm quite vocal about how I'm pro Second Amendment. I'm more of a constitutionalist, and because of that, and because of my background as, you know, somebody of the LDS faith, and being in Utah where I live, where that's a huge part of the population, I'd say probably a majority is of the LDS faith. It was always put on me that, you know, I was either pro Trump or pro this, and because I was part of that political ideology, whether I was or not, everything else that went along with that political ideology was also put on top of me. And I'm not saying that it was anything that was hard for me to deal with or anything like that, but again, it was just, and on top of that, I don't really, this may sound like a bad thing, but I just don't really care what people have to think about me, because I know at the end of the day, I know what I think, I know who I am. And if that person wants to put those ideas on me, that's fine. We can talk about it. But I would say that compared to other people like Chris and Arthi and you, I probably don't have the same experience with racial bias, but in terms of a different bias, I definitely did growing up.
Thank you for like giving that check, because like I think often we tend to see biases as racial, but you know, there's definitely those biases that come with, you know, disabilities, and there's so many other categories that we don't even think of. So I just want to say, like, I appreciate that, you know, having that, you giving that perspective.
I think especially like anything that can be ascertained from like the physical. So the first time you look at somebody, like there's a blink, there's a snap judgment that's going to be made based off of either prior experience or what has been perpetuated by a culture or society. So like what you were talking about with The Simpsons, like I bet a lot of people who saw The Simpsons when they were young, like had never met an Indian person before. And so they already have this perception within their minds before they've even had like a viable application to kind of weigh it against. And the same can be said for like so I'll give you an example. I got tattoos, right? And I constantly think about like, do people think I'm dumber, or do people think I'm not articulate? That, and you know, lumped in with the fact that I'm Black, and I was an athlete in college and all of these different things. So it's like, I wonder how much how much assumption is brought into the conversation before I even open my mouth. So I can't even imagine, like if I was like a little person, or if I was, you know, somebody in a more physically disadvantaged situation, how much more that would be relevant to me, because even those subtle things carry weight.
Yeah, and you make a good point, Chris, that people come in with assumptions, and then the responsibility falls on the person that the assumptions are being made on to make those assumptions. Even though technically, if you have an assumption of someone, you should be looking to break those assumptions about that person. So I don't know if you can speak to this experience, but do you feel like you inherently go into conversations trying to break those assumptions right off the bat?
For sure. Especially in college, there was, in college and interviews and things like that, I go in with that mindset. And I think in general, it's probably helped me, because I would say I have like a little bit more of a chip on my shoulder. So I want to be someone who proves myself and proves those stereotypes wrong. So in some ways, it isn't like a negative thing that I have those biases. And then if it's a bias like that, and you do, or an assumption like that, or a stereotype like that, and you do end up breaking the norm, you're looked as an outlier now in a good way. So there are things, I think so often, I think that's like what's nice about you guys are very pragmatic. I can already tell that. And when we talked earlier, so it's going to be interesting to see how many, because not everything about biases and perception has to be, especially preconceived notions, has to be negative. They can be used to your advantage. It's just navigating social situations in general. But yeah, to answer your question, for sure, I definitely step into situations feeling like I need to
I have a
to break
question
that
about
stereotype.
that. So in terms of stepping into a situation, at what point do you feel like you have to prove somebody wrong? Does that make sense? Because I feel like
Yeah,
at that point, like even on my side, if I were to go up to somebody and feel like I have to prove that I have to prove myself wrong to that person, at what point do we all like see that as a bias as well, to where we're going to somebody else and we're already thinking that they have a bias against us, to where we have to, prove them wrong. So that's where I find it really hard is, and implicit bias is just hard in and of itself, because it's not something that's easily changed, and it's something that doesn't always manifests itself in an action, right? Because that's why it's an implicit bias or subconscious bias. And so I guess my question to you, Chris, and to anybody else is, at what point do we find that we have to, do we make the assumption and make the decision that that person has a negative bias against us?
right. It's highly contextual. So I would say more times than not, like I don't go into every situation being like, well, this guy or this girl like has a really negative perception of Black people and like the way that I look specifically. So I have to go into this situation with all of this like overcompensation in order to, prove a bias wrong. But especially in professional settings specifically, in academic settings, I feel like those scenarios are ones where it's not an overt thing, but I think before you have an opportunity to present yourself for who you are, there are inherently going to be biases, because I don't think that those kind of thought processes can ever fully be divorced from human nature, because we're inherently tribal beings. So we want to congregate around people who look like us, think like us, because that's how we survived. So I think it's always going to be like it's going to be highly contextual in which I do that. But I think once I have a conversation with somebody, I think it's pretty easy to tell whether like they do indeed hold a bias or not. So
I would add to that. So, Chris, I think for me, I've noticed that I generally go into a conversation innocent till proven guilty. So I assume they don't have a bias until
yeah,
they give me a reason not to. But to your point, I've noticed that when I go into a group setting, more often than not, they have a bias. If I'm one-on-one with someone, generally they don't have any biases, and it's what I'm saying from my mouth that they're judging as
right,
positive or negative and interacting with that. But I feel like for some reason, when I'm speaking to a new group of people, groupthink becomes a thing. And if that groupthink is negative, the assumptions and biases are more obvious. Okay, so I love how this conversation is going. I wanted to go to the next question. Does the media you consume, that's social media, news, etc., align with what you personally experience? So I'll kick this one off. So I went to Georgia Tech. I know Chris and Arthi, you did as well. They have a G10s notification system. So it's an emergency notification system that alerts us whenever there's a threat to our safety. So in my time there, I was there for 4.5 years. A majority of those alerts were about Black men. I noticed there was a big pattern. So this definitely created an association for me of Black men to more criminal or unsafe activities that I didn't inherently have about white men. And I noticed that just in the ways I was having assumptions about them in my head. And this is even with the fact that I had many Black friends. prior to Georgia Tech, during Georgia Tech, after Georgia Tech, that did not fit that association or personally partake in those criminal or unsafe activities. So I'm bringing that up because I'm an educated woman. I also, like I said, had a lot of Black friends growing up. I played tennis and I had a lot of Black friends growing up. And at Georgia Tech, I had a lot of Black friends as well. And even then, this notification system that popped up on my phone every couple of days talking about Black men in these crimes influenced me. So that was something I noticed about situations when I felt like I was in danger and when I felt like I was in danger. So that was one that stuck out to me. Do you guys have any experiences you would like to share?
For me, I think I've grown a lot further from what I see, like the example you gave. So I grew up in a predominantly white town and there was just like barely any Black people. So I think my understanding then, like I just didn't really have any, I guess I didn't just have any knowledge of like the community or anything like that. But I wouldn't say per se say like there was any negative prejudice held because I just didn't really interact with many Black people at that point. But when I came to tech and specifically Atlanta, like it was a really big learning and unlearning experience, I would have to say. Just, people say Atlanta's like Black Sweden, right? So there was, I think with that, it really helped me. And honestly, like I think a lot of like that, I've met honestly a lot of Indians that actually have like similar things, like even, our generation that has kind of shocked me because, I honestly feel like the opposite. I attribute a part of it due to me being dark skinned. I almost feel like, I'm dark, a Black person's dark, like to me, it's like, I don't really get worried because I'm like, that it doesn't seem fair for me to like judge them like that when I'm literally like, we have the same, like our hands are the same color. I will have to say though, like I feel more worried honestly when I go into like white areas. That's where my bias is. And kind of going on with the first question is I especially recently have to catch myself from assuming that like everyone's out to get me or has some negative bias against me. I don't think I give people the benefit of the doubt enough. So that's definitely something I'm catching myself doing. Especially growing up in, I know I said my town is predominantly white, but New Jersey as a whole, I would say, is pretty diverse. I think the South is different from that. Atlanta is definitely, to me, more diverse, but once you step outside of that, I tend not to go past certain exits and step out of my car, things like that. So I think my bias is more on the flip side, but I admit that I need to, catch myself because obviously not everyone, is, you can racist, but that's just, I guess that goes back to the racial bias thing.
Yep.
Yeah. One time I was giving an Indian guy a ride and he was just like, yeah, I'm the type of Indian guy, if I were to see like a Black person across the street, like I'd walk the other way. And I was just like, I was appalled because he also was darker skin tone too. So I was just like, like literally,
Yeah.
huh?
No,
Yeah, you can go.
add on to that, Arthi, like in the Indian American community, but also our parents' generation who
Yeah,
immigrated
100%.
here. I think that's where I was very surprised that there was that big of a bias, I guess, against the Black community. And I don't want to say against, but just like there is a bias about the Black community when they were in India and they immigrated here. I think that's a big indicator of how strong media is and how influential media is. Because they could have easily come here and just started mingling with any community. But it's very obvious that, I mean, we've come a long way, but even 15, 20, 30 years ago, the media portrayed Black people as lesser than. And when an immigrant is coming here for a land of opportunity, it's like which community do I associate with to get higher in society, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's where some of my bias came from. My parents are really great educated people, but there were definitely conversations that made me think one way about the Black community and another way about the white community.
What kind of came out of, you can say, colonialism in a way. And I think across many cultures, usually like the darker, the darker you are, the more negative is viewed. And in a way, I think, Indians took that too. And, when they came to America, going along with the media and what was portrayed from the lack of diversity, right? They didn't see anything better. So they associate success, with being white, and I guess specifically like white males, even white women view like white male as like successful, right? Like the standards of success. But yeah, I didn't mean by when I said shocked, by Indians having that. Like I am shocked, but I'm not surprised, I should say, at the same time, because I mean my parents have definitely said some things where I've had to check them. I mean, so many Indians have said things, so yeah, it's just I've heard it a lot, but it's still, sometimes when you hear it in like 2020, it's just like, dang. So that's just where I come from. So
do you feel like the media has what the media is portraying aligns with what you personally experience? Because I feel like a lot of it has not, in my experience, in the sense that when media is portraying a community, even if it's the white community or the Indian community, anytime it portrays a community as a whole, I've noticed that it misses the mark, and it doesn't usually align with my personal experiences with people in that community. I mean, I think that's a big problem of generalizing or stereotyping or grouping people.
I think it misses the mark most of the time because what it does hit is the extreme, and the extreme sells. So I think what sucks about the media, what sucks about even social media, is that if you have a certain belief in something, your social media page is going to be flooded with that because that's what sells to you and that's what makes the company money, right? Same thing goes with the news, whether it's a right-wing news or a left-wing news or even a centralized news. They have to find an extreme to sell because that's what makes them money. It's boring to say that, oh, we found that, nobody has in this community has as much of a racial bias, or, the white community as a whole isn't really racist, or the Black community as a whole isn't racist, or the Asian community as a whole isn't racist. That's boring. And so it's unfortunate because the news is where we get all of our information about what's happening around the world, and the fact that it's flooded with a lot of things that do miss the mark is really unfortunate. I'm not saying that that's the majority of the time, because obviously there are points to where the media does get it right, but in my opinion, it's few and how do you say that? Few and far between. But
yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of pivot to that side of the equation, that kind of discussion, Ethan, because I think you bring up a pretty good point about like when you have a society that's like, we were established on principles that are pretty polarized, and so we have a political system that either like operates on one end of the spectrum or the other. There's very little that is bipartisan. You have situations like that where things are perpetuated in order to create a narrative or a scenario or a story that sells to a certain demographic of people. So just based off of personal experience, I kind of alluded to this earlier about like different situations that I've been in with the law, in which I've never been arrested before. I don't have anything on my record, and like that's because I was compliant. I never argued with a police officer, and part of that is that conversation that I'm sure you guys have heard about now, is when I was at home when I was young, my parents were always like, you need to be more careful than some of your friends because of the way that you look. There, you are going to run into situations like this. So I did apply those principles of ensuring that I was extremely respectful, would say yes or no, sir, whatever I needed to do. And I never experienced any kind of violence. I never experienced, once I had an opportunity to interact with the officer, I never had anything inherently wrong happen to me. And even if there was some sort of bias that was associated with the initial interaction, um, the back end of that was not, it wasn't a violent outcome, and I think the assumption nowadays is that all police officers are bad. And when police officers run into Black people, they have this rampant desire to, especially if they're white and he or she is Black, to commit some sort of violent act upon them, and to detain them and arrest them. But that really isn't the case. I think I would say 99.9% of police officers are very honest, good, genuine people who want to help their communities. And more times than not, when negative things happen, they happen because one, an individual is not being compliant, and two, the other person is extremely scared. And I think we don't talk about that enough, like the lack of training that plays into that. That's a whole other part of the equation. Is it accurate? So no, it does not align with my personal experience. I know it happens. I know it is definitely an issue, but I don't think it's as pervasive or as simple of an issue as it is being postulated to be. I think very often there are a bunch of different variables that play into it, instead of that one interaction or that one situation that we see from somebody's camera phone,
And it turns into propaganda, is what I think,
For sure. Yeah.
it ends up being when it's reporting on the extremes rather than our day-to-day actual experiences. Okay, so to pivot from high-level media society, right, thoughts, let's talk about our individual interactions, our day-to-day interactions with our friends. So when something racist or stereotypical is said in your social groups, what do you do?
Yeah, I can go ahead. So definitely in the past, I would say, growing up, like I mentioned, I grew up in a predominantly white community. There's a handful of Asians there, and I think we would just go along with the jokes, and even make jokes ourselves. That was kind of our way of accepting or assimilating. But I would say now, especially with the recent events, like I've become way more vocal, and I have no problem. Well, I shouldn't say no problem. On social media, I don't have any problem calling out people. It's sometimes harder to do face to face. Sometimes when you have a relationship with someone, right? You're like invested in them. It's hard when they don't view things eye to eye with you. So it's kind of like, do you want to pick the battle? But I definitely have picked the battle a lot more recently. And I think it's, sometimes you need to do that to make some progress, right? And I'm not saying that everyone, like I've come to the understanding now, especially now, that, people have these biases. It's not like it's not because they're trying to hurt someone, or, necessarily doesn't make them dangerous. It's just, they were just brought up with that, it's subconscious. So a lot of times if you don't really call them out, they're just going to continue that. And I think that's where, you need those type of civil conversations. So yeah, that's kind of where I am with that. I've recently been having a lot of these conversations and catching myself, of course, from jumping to conclusions. But yeah, I think these have been really valuable recently, just these open discussions.
To add on to that, Arthi, I think you said pick your battles, right? And that's a good point. I think a lot of people find it easier to allow it to happen, right? These comments to be made. It's harder and more uncomfortable and longer to have a calling someone out kind of conversation. And I think for me, where I've found the most success is challenging people's thoughts rather than assuming something about what they've said. So I usually ask a lot of, oh, why do you think that? Or where is that coming from? To get them to realize that this is not a valid thought, I guess. And I like it when people do that to me too. So I think, and that honestly creates more of a conversation rather than an attack or a shame or like a group mockery. And I think when we shame people by saying like, oh, you're racist for saying that in a group setting, it doesn't teach anyone. it's more
Yeah, I
of,
think it's super important to be educational in those
Mhm.
types of situations. For instance, around the little people community, the word midget is very, very like derogatory, and it's still a word that's used widely today. And so there's been tons of times where I've, you know, heard it around me or my friends have said it, and it's just so much, there's such a better outcome when it's done with an educational spin on it, instead of being like, what the hell's wrong with you, like why would you, like you're so stupid for saying that, don't you know, like obviously he doesn't know, or he probably wouldn't have said it, right? And I as an example, I had a rep that I used to work with, and he said the word, you know, midget, and I kind of talked to him about why that wasn't the right word to say. And every time I see him now, he tells me a story about how he educated somebody else about not using that word and how it's
Right.
derogatory and rude. So I think what sucks about today too is that a lot of media is around, you know, this whole racial issue that is in America. And I think they always show people being using an attack and doing it the wrong way, in my opinion, that a lot of people tend to float that way when they want to correct somebody. And I think when we're more educational, there's a lot better outcome from it.
plus it's also cool. It's cool to do this. I think people like who are in the younger groups or older are like, this isn't the time or place. Like this party isn't the time or place to have this conversation. But it takes like a minute to educate someone on something if you are educated on it and to have that conversation. And the more and more you practice it, I find it cool to have that kind of conversation no matter the setting. Personally, I think growing up when we were younger, it was seen as, oh, you can't take a joke, or like this was clearly a joke, but
Yeah.
I
I
just
hope that
wanted
we can get that across.
Yeah.
I
I
just wanted
think
to ask.
Arthi, go ahead, Arthi.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask if you don't mind, for us and also just anyone who watches, like, letting us know, I guess, why the word midget is bad. You know, I'd love to learn too.
It's always been used as a very derogatory term. So it's really,
What
even
do
though it's a medical term, meaning that there's a bunch of different types of little people, and midget was made as a medical term. The context of it over a long time has been used as a derogatory thing to make fun of or belittle, you know, little people in general. And so, you know, it's like any other derogatory term. It started somewhere and was used in the wrong context for way too long and in the wrong sense. And so, you know, more power to him to say, you know, that's not the right word to use to describe me at all. So
and little person or people, is that the correct
yeah.
terminology nowadays? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
But I think to your point too, I appreciate you doing that. But as well, I'd like to say that I think you made a good point in terms of we need to also pick our battles. I think there's also several people when you start talking to them that just aren't going to listen at that point. I feel like it's also for us that are more emotionally mature, I'd like to say, I think it's a lot better for us to also pick our battles. And it's really unfortunate that those people are out there that don't want to learn or change or have these conversations. But
Yeah, I
I
think
thought
there's
that was a good point.
specifically. Chris, did
Yeah.
you have something you wanted to say about this?
No, I mean, I think you guys put a nice bow on it, but yeah, I would definitely echo Ethan's point in that if you've been able to tell just through the conversation that the maturity level from an emotional standpoint, there's a pretty wide chasm between. You can be Socratic about it and ask questions and see if they can, ascertain what they need to learn from that scenario. But more times than not, if people don't want to see it, they're not going to. So I think you definitely do have to have some discernment in terms of what context you speak into, if it's the right time, place, person to be trying to teach a lesson, because it can be, for lack of a better word, like wasted breath.
Yeah, or fall
Which
on.
is unfortunate, but true.
Yeah, fall on deaf ears. I agree with that. Okay, so the last question. How do you personally address and work on your implicit bias? So I can start for this one. I have two ways I've been actively trying to do this. One, I focus on preventing behaviors where I would be acting on my implicit bias. And I do that by educating myself through reading books, listening to podcasts, engaging in these kind of, sometimes uncomfortable conversations that challenge my previously held prejudices. And then two, I put myself in controlled, safe, real world situations to expose myself to people in a racial group or a group in general I was previously biased towards, to see if my experiences actually mirror what's said in the media. I think that's really important. It's like testing what the media is saying. And like we talked about just 5-10 minutes ago, the media has been portraying the extremes for a while. So rather than just digesting what's said in the media as truth, I like to test it in my personal experiences. So those are two ways that I've been addressing and trying to work on it. Obviously, they're subconscious and there's many implicit biases I probably still hold, but I think actively trying to work on them is extremely important. What about you guys?
I think the biggest thing is we're always going to have biases no matter what. And I think the biggest thing that I tend to work on is not acting on them. And I feel like the way that I was raised and the experiences that I've been through, more specifically, I also lived in Brazil for 2 years. And so seeing that whole group of people and really getting to know a lot of them down there, is that if I ever catch myself having a bias that is purely on a racial standpoint, it all goes back to, you don't know that person, you don't know what they're doing, and you don't know what they've been through. And I feel like if I do have a bias, it's usually because of their attitude. So how they're acting towards me, or if I'm interacting with them, and what they're actively doing, is when I would say I form a bias, if I even have one. But I think what the focus should be on is how we manifest those biases if we have them. Like I said before, I think it's super hard to teach somebody to have a different bias or not have one, just because of how innate it is for anybody to have a bias. And I think what is the most important part is teaching ourselves to not act on them, and to make sure that what we're thinking is valid. But like I said, it's more about how that person's acting towards me than anything. But again, that's if I'm interacting with that person at all. So I just asked my question, do you know that person or do you not know that person? And what's the point of having a bias if you're not even going to interact with them? But
like I completely agree, and I think that connects a little bit to that emotional maturity that you said. For me personally, I've definitely, of course, like I think that what you're going off of what you're saying, that's looking internally, questioning yourself. I think that's like a great way just to make sure, you don't judge a book by its cover. And going off of Uha, I think there's a lot of media now we can listen to, read on, that helps break these down and just gets you to reflect. I think reflecting is one of the biggest things that can help you. And yeah, like I like I said, I'll admit, I just have to check myself when I jump to conclusions and catch myself. And even beyond that, I think we'll make mistakes, and having a circle around you of people who call you out, and letting them know that you're okay with them doing that, that you're comfortable to having those conversations, I think is also very valuable. So just wanted to add that.
Being willing to say when you're wrong too.
Mm-hmm.
And like realizing that you make mistakes and you act on your implicit biases.
Yeah. Yeah, I think humility and the ability to learn and pivot, and a willingness to, are like extremely important. And I think another facet of that, like that exploration and trying to develop uh, your capacity for understanding other people, comes into your capacity for understanding yourself too. Many times people are afraid, especially nowadays, they're afraid to spend time alone, the other phone, without all the stimulus that we have from various social media, things like that, and to meditate or to just spend time with their thoughts and realize they probably aren't as good or wise as they might have perceived themselves to be in certain situations where they feel like they can jump on it and be like, oh, this isn't an opportunity, kind of like what Ethan was saying before. Like a lot of people can take those opportunities when someone is objectively wrong and put them down. But once you realize that there's so much that you have to work on, then you can dive into yourself and start to address those and ask yourself those same questions that you would ask someone else. And I think that's a big part of that process of just learning about other people and then being able to impart that knowledge onto others in a way that is loving and not condescending.
Yeah, I agree with you. Self-awareness is so important. And before you point a finger at someone else, you should definitely be like cognizant of your own biases first. Okay, so I'm getting swallowed into the darkness, clearly.
I was like, "Whoa, what's going on?"
I should have turned a light on. I should have turned a light on. So before I get swallowed into the darkness, I'm going to wrap it up. I just want to conclude with these conversations are important. It helps us practice and strengthen our ability to understand another person and empathize. I hope this sparks a desire to engage in these conversations in your personal or professional life so you can start cultivating, practicing, and strengthening this skill. I really want to thank you guys for participating and kicking off this series. And thank you for watching.
I just want to say thank you, everyone, too, for giving your input too. This was a learning experience too, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, it was super fun.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I enjoy that too.